So this set of videos is a tutorial on how to guide you through the process from start to finish on setting up an Unreal Engine 4 VR project. So first thing we need to do is to set up our file structure, know how Unreal Engine sets up its file structure. So here we have our Epic Games launcher. At this point, you would have already inputted your Epic Games account credentials. And we can go ahead and start the appropriate version, in this case, 4.27, which is the latest version. And I'm going to go ahead and launch Unreal Engine. So Unreal Engine opens and it allows us to select a pre-existing project or to create a new project. We're going to select the games template, hit next. And this particular set of tutorials is geared towards VR. So we're going to select the virtual reality template and click next. We can include starter content if we want to. Let's just add starter content just so we have some things to play with within Unreal Engine once we start the project. But if you want to completely clean an empty file, you would select no starter content. And so down here, we can see the default directory for where our Unreal Engine projects will go. So the way I have my computer set up is on the C drive, there is a Dropbox folder, and within that, I have Unreal projects. And so, this just allows me to have like a cloud backup of my Unreal Engine projects. And then we give it a project name. No spaces are allowed within this, and it's better to keep all of these things short. So don't put folders within folders within folders, but just try to keep it as close to the C directory as possible. So let's just call this my first VR project, and then we'll let Unreal Engine create that project for us. But once it opens, we are presented with the basic Unreal Engine 4 interface. Again, the left side, you have some basic elements that you can insert into your scene. Here's your viewport. You have your world outliner, which contains all of the objects and assets that are in the current level. The current level name is on the top here, which is called VR template map. And if you select an object on the level, you can adjust its attributes in the details panel down here. And then there's also a tab for sort of global settings, which we may or may not talk about. We probably don't need to mess with these things too much. And then down here, we have our content browser. And so if I click on this little icon, I get sort of a window stack version of what's in my content browser, or in my content folder. And this content folder is exactly the same as this content folder. So everything in here is in here. And this is what we kind of refer to as the closet or the back of house of the theater, using the theater analogy, where each map represents a stage. So this is the stuff that came in with the VR template. We opted for starter content, and so you can start to see there are some elements in the starter content. You can start to bring them in, drag them in. There are walls with door openings, walls with window openings, just random elements like light fixtures. There are some maps that might start showing some of the sample content in there. And then there are some default materials. So like if I wanted to use cobblestone on this wall, for instance, I can just drag that material in and it'll update that material to look like this stone. So there's some basic elements that might be of use in the starter content. If you chose not to bring in the starter content, you can always import it by clicking on this add import, go to add features or content pack, go to content pack and select starter content here. You could also bring in other templates. So for instance, if we are developing VR, but we don't have a headset connected to our computer, we could import the third person template, for instance, so that we can, test out our scene in third person mode and then switch back to VR when we're ready to do so. If movement is a little bit too fast, we can adjust the speed of that movement by changing the camera speed up here. And so the camera moves a little bit more slowly. And we can also adjust certain things in our view options here. We can change the size of our thumbnail. So if you want to reduce the size of the content browser to increase the size of the viewport, you might want to shrink down the folder so more of it is visible. And the other sort of view mode options that you might want to consider is to consider looking at the scene in the unlit mode if the lighting is, for instance, very dramatic and you just want to be able to see everything that's going on. This will just get rid of all of the lighting information. So in other words, it'll get rid of all of the shadows and you just see a flat image. There are some other features. Lighting only turns off all of the materials and you just see light and shadow on the surfaces. And so if you're particularly interested in tweaking the lighting, you might want to use the lighting only mode so that the materials aren't affecting the lighting, you just see the light and shadow on the surfaces. But typically we'll be in lit mode. Of course, there's different viewports. We have by default the perspective view, but we can do our top, bottom, left, right, front, back views. These are just the orthographic views. Also on top are a series of buttons that allow us to change modes from translating an object or moving an object to rotating an object, and you can see that the widget changes depending on what you have selected, or scaling. These are some snapping options, so we can turn off grid snapping, for instance, or reduce the snap to different values. Same goes for rotation snapping, where if the rotation snapping is on, here it'll snap to every 10 degrees. So if we go to our rotation mode, every sort of move snaps to a 10-degree rotation. If we want to reduce that down, we can, or we can just turn it off completely where the rotation is just much smoother. Let's turn that. The rotation is much smoother and much more random. So if you want to really control these things, you might want to use the snaps. Same with scale. You can also adjust all of these parameters in the detail panels. So we can type in rotation values, scale values, and and their location values. And these are all X, Y, and Z. So X is red, Y is green, and Z is blue. Hotkeys, if you're interested, are W for move, E for rotate, and R for scale. As you start working in this, the hotkeys start to be a little bit faster than going up here and clicking some of these elements. Okay, that's just some basic tips on navigating. As I mentioned, the VR template map is what we start with. If we take a look inside of the content here and go into the VR template, we can see that that map is organized in this map folder, which makes a whole lot of sense. If we wanted to create our own map or a new map, we can certainly do that. But one thing you'll want to do after you create your own map is to go into project settings, and in maps and modes, we'll want to change our editor startup map and our game default map to be the map that you created. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to sort of close these up, and I'm going to create a new folder. Let's, just right click, new folder. Let's call it Virtual Futures Map. And then I'm gonna go to the add import, and I'm gonna click on this level, which will create an entirely new level. I can call this final project. And what this does is in this folder creates an entirely new map. So now if I double click on this map, it's going to ask me if I want to save what I changed or did in the map that I was in. So we can go ahead and hit save selected. And then now it takes us into our completely empty map. And you can see it's empty because it's completely black, right? Even if I go into the unlit mode, everything, there's just nothing in here. And so we're essentially starting a map from scratch. You can go into that VR template map and just sort of select these elements and delete them and create your project within this map. Or if you want to just have a clean start, you can create an entirely new map and start from scratch. But we'll need to sort of create or add certain elements so that we get the visualization of certain things like the atmosphere. We'll need a light at some point to light the scene, but it's not a difficult process to complete. So if we go and click BP Sky Sphere, this is BP standing for blueprint, and Sky Sphere is just an asset that comes with Unreal Engine that just sort of brings an atmosphere, gives us an atmosphere. And so we can drag that into our scene. I'm going to clear the search, so now we can see we have our Sky Sphere in our scene. We'll also want some lights. So I'm going to go to lights and bring in a directional light. So a directional light, for those of you who aren't familiar with these types of lights, directional lights always cast their light in a parallel direction, and it's intended to mimic the sun. Point lights are lights from a single source, and they just sort of radiate outwards. Spotlights are lights from a specific source, but they spread their light in a cone, basically. And rectangular lights are sort of like if you like think of a fluorescent light fixture, for instance, where you have an array of lights kind of trying to cast an even light across a rectangular surface. It's kind of how it works. And then you might also want to drag a skylight, which sort of adds a little bit more ambient light. And so if we go into our BP Sky Sphere, what we need to do is designate a light that the Sky Sphere will use as the sun. And so here we can click on this drop-down arrow, and it's going to show us what lights are currently in the scene that are available to be designated as the sun. So I'm going to pick my directional light, and so the sky sphere will automatically adjust its tone and its color based on the direction of this directional light. So now, because it's sort of pointing down, it's as though the sun is sort of higher up in the sky, and so the sky is blue. Okay, and so, I mean, this is pretty much all you would need to kind of create like a lifelike environment. A couple of other things we'll want to add are some volumes, right? Only really important thing, the two volumes that you'll want to add is the Lightmass importance volume. Just so you know what this is, Lightmass is the rendering engine that Unreal Engine uses. And if you go into the world settings under Lightmass, you can start to adjust some of those settings. And so this is like V-Ray or Arnold or Octane. It's just a rendering engine that's inherent or native to Unreal Engine. And what this volume does is it sort of sequesters a portion of the map that lighting is most important in. And so you just want to surround the most important elements of your project. The other project or the other volume you're going to want to add is a post-processing volume. And the closest thing or the best way of thinking about this is it's sort of like a volume of Photoshop type filters. And so if I'm in the post-processing volume, certain attributes or certain adjustments will be visible. And when I'm not in the volume, those attributes will not be visible. So for instance, let me go into, with the post-process volume selected, I can go into my detail panels and I can change my white balance, for instance, or rather I might create a tint. Let me just go back to the tint. I'm just going to adjust the tint. And this is just really to demonstrate how the post-processing volume works. So I made an adjustment to the post-processing volume, but I'm not really going to see that change until I enter that volume, right? So you can see when I go forward and I enter, I can start to see that tint change so that I can kind of control where certain lighting effects might occur, right? And I can do this for a variety of settings or effects. I could have additional. Well, actually, one thing we can do is bring in a cube. Let's move these things into our volume. One thing about post-processing volumes is if you don't want that effect to just occur within the volume, and instead you want it to sort of happen everywhere, you can search for infinite extent, which just means the volume itself will be ignored and the post-processing will be applied throughout the scene. So now if we look, we have a light. I can take this light and up the intensity. And if I go into my post-processing volume, I can kind of up the intensity of the bloom, and you can see like what bloom kind of does is it gives like that glowing kind of foggy appearance. And so that's a post-processing effect, right? You can change a variety of things here. It's almost like having camera settings sort of globally applied. We can change the exposure and make things really bright or really dark. It's kind of like how when you change the exposure on the camera, you either allow more light to enter or less light. Okay, so that's basically the components that you really want in your scene. You may not even want a sky sphere. You just want it to be black and sort of create something of an abstract space. A directional light that operates as your sun. A light mass importance volume, which sort of designates the area of your scene that needs to be rendered more accurately. Post-processing volume, it's not 100% necessary, but if you want to start adding some of these lighting effects, camera depth of field, exposure, bloom are probably the biggest things that you might play around with, as well as color tints and things like that if you want to give change the atmosphere a little bit and give like an overall color grade, change the white balance on the scene. You can do all of that in the post-process volume. And then the skylight is just sort of more ambient light, and it really works with light bounces. And so those are kind of the primary elements that you would want. And then you can kind of drag in other elements from here, or you can start to import some of the assets that you've been working on by going to add import and adding or importing FBX assets, or later on we'll talk about Datasmith, which is a way of importing a bunch of assets without having to do it one at a time. And so at this point, you're sort of ready to import those assets and start lighting them, blocking them out, and testing them out, whether it's in VR or in third-person gaming mode. And then the last thing to discuss, and I might switch my map here. I'm going to go back to my VR template. So I'm going to save the map that I created. The last thing I want to talk about is building lighting. And this is so this video is really dedicated towards the very basic things, but also some very important things to note as you build your scenes. So the reason why, or the way Unreal Engine works is Unreal Engine is a real-time rendered scene, which means all of the lighting is sort of available regardless of where we look. So it's kind of like a fully rendered, immersive or a 360 rendered environment that we can start to look around in Rhino or 3ds Max or other 3D modeling software. You kind of need to hit the render button in order to get the lighting and shadow information that Unreal Engine can provide in real time. And so the reason that works is through this process of light baking. And so light baking, if you think about instead of calculating light, which is what rendering engines do, it's not calculating light real time. What it's doing is it's calculating light once and then kind of painting shadows onto these surfaces. So the way that works now, if I take this box and move it, you can see that this box is casting shadow from the sun, but the shadow that was baked doesn't move. And so at some point when the light bake was done, Lightmass, which is the rendering engine, calculated the shadows where it would appear. This side of the cube is dark. The cube itself casts a shadow, going in this orientation based on the location of the skylight. But if I move an object, you can see that the shadow, so this shadow that's being cast now is a dynamic shadow, which means it's being updated in real time based on the lighting in the scene. but the shadow on this floor surface here has been baked in. And so the advantage of a baked light scene is you can get real shadow information and have a scene appear to be fully rendered without taxing the processor to run the lighting calculation in real time. So it's sort of a way of cheating the system. The way we designate whether or not something is something can have baked lighting versus not have baked lighting is this mobility designation here. So if I take this cube and I set this to movable, what this means is when I run my light bake, it's not going to bake this shadow because we're telling Unreal Engine that, oh, this is an object that's going to move around. Therefore, don't bake the shadow, which is going to break the immersion or break the illusion of the shadow being cast or break the illusion of real-time rendering. Let's go with static first. Static means that this cube is never going to move, which means I should always bake the shadows on the surfaces and bake its cast shadow onto the surfaces. And if we select the floor plane, it's also static. So it's basically saying these are the elements that are not moving. Therefore, bake the lighting and don't use any dynamic lighting with it. So for the most part, architecture, things that don't move should always be designated as static. And something like a character that might be moving around in your scene should always be designated as movable, right? So let's make this cube static again. You can see we sort of broke our light bake because we moved that cube. And so in order to bake the shadow again, we go into our build options, and we go to build lighting only. And we let that run. And what it's going to do is Lightmass, which is the rendering engine, is essentially going to run that rendering process. And now we can see that Lightmass has figured out that, oh, that cube moved, this shadow no longer appears, and that shadow is now baked over on Bing. If we were to bring in our third person character, right? Because this character has been set up and provided by Epic Games with all of the functionality of movement. They also consider the fact that the character moves, and so the character will always cast a dynamic shadow, right? But every time you move something that's static, you are going to want to build lighting. And then the last thing to note is if we go to our build options, we can go to lighting quality. And we're going to want to keep this set at preview. And so what this is stating is that the light build will be performed at a reduced quality. But once we're getting close to the end of production, once we're getting close to finishing the project, we might then want to change our quality level to high or production. What that's going to mean is that the light bake is going to take much longer, but the shadow information is going to be much more resolved. The quality is going to be much higher. And so you'll want to do a production build every so often just to kind of get a sense of what the full light build is going to look like. For the most part, you're going to want to use preview so you don't have to wait for those long rendering times. Okay, so basically what we've covered here is starting a new project. So creating a new project, understanding project directory, where project files and folders are saved. All of the all of the assets related to an Unreal Engine project is saved into a project folder that sits in a project directory, and that directory is a folder that you designate for all of your Unreal Engine 4 projects. Within that folder is a content browser, or the content folder, and that content folder relates directly to what's in your content browser here. We talked about maps and levels, what that means. A map is like a stage where you can start to like place actors and assets and light the scene, and provide some effects like post-processing. But you could have multiple maps or multiple stages within sort of our overall theater, right? We talked about how to designate what map is default map. So again, going to edit project settings, maps and modes. And so now if I want to designate my final project level as my default level, I can adjust the editor startup map into default map here. And then we talked about building lighting. We're going to want to do that fairly often. Every time you move something or add another asset that's static, you're going to want to perform a light build. We talked about camera speed. We talked about snaps, turning them on and off. We talked about the move, rotate, scale buttons, which correspond to W, E, and R. We talked about some of these view options. We can change the size of our thumbnail here, depending on how small you make your content browser. Okay, so these are the very basic bones of your VR project or your Unreal Engine project. And so at this point, you can even create your final project directory or final project and place it in your Unreal Engine 4 project directory. And then you can work on your assets and start to import them. And we'll talk about that in a later tutorial.